what else have our liberal teachers told us that are lies?
Well, sir, that's a great question. There are about 10 chapters in the book. I usually do these kind of 10 chapter structures that fit together loosely, but I think pretty well. And basically, lies my liberal teacher told me to answer the question explicitly. Each chapter focuses on something that most people now believe. Sometimes I do a statistical analysis. Very often I just look at what the textbooks say, but that is wildly inaccurate. So one such example would be Native Americans were peaceful. Um, they're peaceful people, dances with wolves. They spend all day in making love and growing crops.
Living in balanced harmony with nature.
Well, that actually, even more so than peaceful, I think is a good description of the focus there. Yeah. So that chapter opens with an official Department of Agriculture lesson on Native nations. And they actually say things like this, a la, the Native Americans had no word for want. They never killed an animal out of need or took a fish they did not plan to use, and just on and on and on. A peaceful, harmonious people. This is like a 16-page lesson that's gone out to thousands of schools.
I'm laughing because I know that among the practices for hunting buffalo was to drive entire herds off the edge of cliffs. And this is before you could refrigerate any meat. So almost all of the dead buffalo that would run off the cliff would just rot. So but continue.
No, I mean,
Sorry.
yeah, they would do that. The only meat you would take would be the tongue and the back hump, because that's apparently the best part of a buffalo, and you just killed 1,000 of them. Yeah, the natives were interesting people, great warriors, fascinating religious tradition, but the idea that they were any better morally than the people they fought is extremely bizarre, and I think could only have been believed in sort of the very recent past. But just chapter after chapter goes through these things. One of the chapters looks at the idea of the Red Scare. And so the entire question was, were there actually communists in Russia and communist spies in the USA during this time? And to myself or you, that might even seem like an almost stupid, intelligence insulting question. But the answer is yes. I mean, we have a list of papers in political science known as the Venona Papers that look at the Russian agents that were in the United States by name. So Alger Hiss and most of these other people that were protected by entire sectors of the political left were actually Russian spies. And we've known that for 20 years. Dalton Trumbo, as we've gone on making movies and so on, lionizing these guys. So that's a chapter of the book. I do have one chapter. This has already been said extensively on kind of the center right, but I have one chapter looking at slavery globally. And not really gloating about the miserable performance of any of the races. We were all doing this, but just saying, well, one of the first human words was slave. I mean, the Sumerian glyph for man from the mountains, there's a similar word that has man from the mountains with chains around his wrists, again, after some kind of military conflict, and that means slave. So, and there's woman from the mountains, which is a little more explicit, and that means slave as well. So, I mean, one of the first things that we did after encountering other people was to fight them. I mean, none of them are all that graphic. It's just like they're drawn on clay with reeds at this point. But I mean, like, one of the first things we did after encountering other genuinely different human beings was fight them, take prisoners, take concubines, so on down the line. So to pretend that Western European and American white people invented this over the last couple of hundred years borders on the insane. It's kind of an internalized pathology of guilt. But I mean, there are a number of other chapters. What happened, white flight in the 1960s? What was the real cause of that after Great Society social policy? I also talk about Black and Caucasian family collapse in that chapter. There's another chapter devoted to kind of the lies of today. Are we seeing an epidemic of young men being murdered by police? Are we seeing an epidemic of interracial crime on either side? An epidemic of hate crimes? Is cultural appropriation real? What about white privilege? And then there are 5 more. Each chapter just takes on something that's very popular today, but that has very little evidence supporting it, at least in my opinion.
So there is this thing going on that I don't have an answer for, and I'm curious how you think about it, which is that if you pick up your book and you are the one to drop the scales from the reader's eyes about all of these narratives, one thing you can come away from feeling is that everything is BS, that everything's a lie, that all of our institutions are shot through with liars and crooks and thieves, and that everything is awful, really. Like it's there is like a path to kind of a nihilism. And even if you don't get all the way to being a full cynic, you are still left with a question of, well, who do I trust now? Because all of my teachers lied to me and told me these grand stories on which their entire ideology is based about who's an oppressor and what's the nature of power and reality itself. And they're all sort of lies. How do you think about navigating this world we're in when we are surrounded by so many easily falsified stories from people who claim to be experts and have letters after their names and call themselves doctor and all of that?
Well, I mean, first of all, if you're a professor of gender studies or whatever, you should never call yourself doctor. But I mean, like I think that there are two real answers. One of them, to crib a wiser man than I, or at least a better spoken man than I, is trust but verify. So when you see something in mass media, I mean, and this is a trend you see very much on Twitter or Facebook, where you'll see videos of a guy of one race being beaten up by someone of the other, a cop or three black guys or something. And there's a mob of people screaming, happens all the time, every day. They'll get you. You know, don't go outside. Before believing in that kind of nonsense, it's probably a good idea to actually, and I guess this is part of the answer to your question, go look at easily available data and see what reality is. I mean, the national crime rate, it's called the BJS-NCVS, the Bureau of Justice Statistics National Crime Victimization Survey. Anyone who's graduated from college or a good high school can figure this out, and you just go online and look it up. I mean, I don't want to volunteer myself for 10,000 unsolicited emails, but for you guys watching this, if you email me, if you find me using my sales techniques and email me, I'll tell you where to find the basic crime data or the basic healthcare data in the USA.
Right.
So that I think is a big part of the answer. When you see something, you shouldn't automatically believe it, but that shouldn't make you a trust-free cynic either. There are sources you can believe in, whether that's some reliable local media or your intimate partner, or more importantly, the actual data resources themselves. Like, we're not just making up the national crime data. It might be slanted 5% to the left or the right, depending on the president, but it just really is there. And there's a lot of stuff like that. The second thing I would add is just use common sense. So, I mean, very, very often we see like 3-year cycles of bullshit that end with people recognizing what everybody already knew anyway. So like we just saw a big paper on the COVID vaccine that basically said COVID vaccine saved a lot of lives, but boosted myocarditis 600% in young males. And I was like, that exact sentence is what I thought about the COVID vaccine 2 weeks out. Like, obviously it's good for seniors. Obviously it's kept some people alive. Also, obviously you're starting to see people fall over on the pitch. So like there's an element of just, this seems to be reality. I'm noticing it. Why shouldn't I believe that? Unless there's a very good reason not to believe, you should generally accept the evidence of your own Mark I eyeballs and of common sense. I'm actually, before I get back into some examples of this trend, just going to repeat, one of the core ideas of Western thought is that there's this skill called logic. I mean, and as, you know, junior professors, we often teach logic 101, ethics 101, American government 101. And using this skill, any country lawyer or homemaker or something like that can serve on a jury, write a letter to the editor of the biggest papers in the country, you know, can do anything along these lines, make shopping decisions that cost $20,000. This just is an ability, decide whether or not to send someone to jail. So when you have this ability to decide to raise your own children to be successes, so when you have this amazing personal ability that almost everyone does, who's a functional taxpayer post-childhood, it's good to rely on it. If you see something that seems absolutely irrational and illogical, like the sentence, some women have 9-inch penises, you should look at that and say, no, that doesn't make sense. And you're probably correct, no matter how many people are speaking against you. But what I'm saying here, to get back to the thought flow of this point, is that very often, after about 2 years of panic, what you'll see is that what everyone knew is revealed to be true. So these studies just kept dropping this past week, right? I mean, there was another one that found that gender-affirming care for kids, quote unquote, doesn't work. The Swedes, the British are pulling back from it. The British closed their god-awful Tavistock clinic. It turns out that if you're an emotionally disturbed 13-year-old girl who has anorexia, making a fake penis out of your leg. I don't know if that would be allowed at that age, but a mastectomy would. That's not going to make you better. You probably should treat the underlying issues, eating disorder, cutting, a parental divorce, whatever those might be. And again, that's something that I think most...
Autism spectrum.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think like every businesswoman, female friend that I have made that point, again, 4 years ago. There are people like Hazel Appleyard on Twitter that have been saying nothing but this for maybe a decade. You know, Watson comes to mind. So we now know that the obvious was true. Like a massive double-blinded study found that the obvious was true. What people who are fighting against the obvious will often do, by the way, is try to stop the study. They'll try to derail it at what's called the IRB level. They'll try to prevent you from publishing it. A lot of the people I've mentioned, like myself and Corey Clark, have been on the receiving end of this kind of thing. Like, oh, look at the names on this. And it's just the most conventional ever breakdown of data in a Stater SPSS spreadsheet. So once it gets through, you generally find that even academic, skillfully put together knowledge conforms to reality. So just hold your ground until that happens, I guess would be another piece of advice. But don't give up on logic, hold your ground until it happens, and find reliable sources of data. If someone asks you what crime is, I don't mean to keep beating this horse to death, I've been talking for a bit, but if someone asks you what crime is, go to the National Crime Report, Google FBI UCR, and you'll find that black people are overrepresented, so are whites in the South, but you'll also find that you're not going to be murdered when you walk outside. Don't go on Facebook and say, man, I saw a video. I know what, fill in the gap Hispanics are capable of. That's not reality.
If you like this clip, you should check out the full video and all the other great content we've got at Dad Saves America. So be sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and ring that bell so you won't miss our new stuff as it drops each week.